Two brothers spotted an abandoned shed while cutting across a quiet field. Its roof sagged, but the door was sealed with a fresh welded lock. When they finally forced it open, what they saw inside made them scream and dial 911, a discovery that would haunt their town forever. Two brothers spot an abandoned shed while cutting across a field. Its door hangs crooked, but the lock is freshly welded shut. When they finally forced it open, what they saw inside made them scream and dial 911. Subscribe to the channel and write where you're watching this video from. Daniel Carter, 34, truck mechanic, protective older brother. Luke Carter, 28, part-time fisherman, restless soul. Both thought it was just an old shed. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The late summer sun beat down gently, pouring light across the Carter brothers' path as they cut across the back fields. The air buzzed with cicadas, and the smell of cut hay drifted from a neighbor's property. For men who had grown up in this rural corner of Pennsylvania, sights and sounds like these were ordinary, almost comforting. Daniel Carter walked ahead, his calloused hands swinging at his sides, boots crunching the dry grass. At 34, his days were usually spent bent over engines at the small garage where he worked. Machines made sense to him, steady, reliable, predictable. He liked things that could be fixed with grease and a wrench. Out here in the quiet fields, he let his shoulders drop, grateful for the wide open land. Luke, younger by 6 years, trailed beside him, tossing a stick into the air and catching it as though the walk were a game. Fishing had been his trade, though his hours were scattered and his life less tied down than his brother's. He carried with him a restlessness, a sense that the world was bigger than these fields, yet he returned here often. Daniel liked to joke that no matter how far Luke went, the land called him back. Their conversation was light. The way brothers talk, often Island Luke teased Daniel about working too many hours, about the grease stains that never seemed to wash out of his fingernails. Daniel grunted back, telling Luke that fishing wasn't a career but a lazy man's excuse to drink beer by water. Luke laughed, tossing the stick higher, catching it behind his back. The rhythm of their banter blended into the summer air, as ordinary as the crunch of their boots. It was Luke who spotted the shed first. From a distance, it looked like any other ruin-sagging roofline, wood panels grayed from weather, a structure long forgotten by whoever once owned the land. Daniel followed his brother's gaze and shrugged. "Another junk shed," he muttered, already turning his eyes away. The landscape was littered with such things: abandoned tool sheds, collapsed barns, relics of farms left behind when families moved on. But something about this one caught Luke's attention. He pointed at the door. "Look at that." Daniel squinted. The shed's frame was tilted, boards rotting along the edges, yet the door stood upright. And on that door a lock, not rusted like the hinges, not dull with years of weather. A new, gleaming lock. "Strange," Daniel said, his brow furrowing. "Why waste money locking up something that's already falling apart?" Luke grinned. "Maybe there's treasure in there." He slapped the side of the shed with his palm, making dust trickle from the roof. Or maybe just a raccoon collection. Cuh. Daniel shook his head, trying to push down the prickling feeling at the back of his neck. He wasn't one for superstitions, but he had learned to trust his instincts. Still, he told himself it was nothing. Probably some farmer storing tools, or kids trying to keep others out of their hideout. The brothers lingered a moment longer, then moved on, letting their talk drift back to everyday matters. Daniel mentioned the stubborn engine of a delivery truck he'd spent hours on the day before. Luke joked about losing a big fish last week, swearing it was the size of my leg. Their words filled the silence, pushing aside the odd sight of the locked shed. Yet as they walked farther, Daniel glanced back. From the corner of his eye, he caught how the sunlight glinted off the lock, sharp, metallic, out of place against the weather-beaten boards. That evening, the brothers returned home. Their mother's old farmhouse, now Daniel's, sat on the edge of the field, its porch paint peeling, rocking chair swaying lightly in the breeze. Luke sprawled on the steps, popping open a soda can, while Daniel leaned against the porch post, arms crossed. They spoke little now, both lost in thought. The shed lay in the distance, just a sliver on the horizon, but it pressed on Daniel's mind. He told himself it didn't matter. He had work in the morning, bills to pay, things that kept life steady. Luke hummed some tune, tapping his foot, but every now and then he too glanced toward the field, toward the crooked silhouette of the shed. The night deepened. Crickets chirped, and an owl hooted from somewhere in the trees. The farmhouse grew still. From the upstairs window, Daniel stared out across the land before finally pulling the curtain closed. The shed, dark and motionless, seemed harmless enough. That night, the shed seemed just another ruin, but morning light showed otherwise. When the brothers crossed the field again the next day, the shed looked different. The roof caught the sun, and its boards cast longer shadows across the ground. And then, without warning, a sound drifted through the air, a sharp metallic creak. Daniel froze. Luke spun, eyes wide. The door had not moved, yet the sound was clear, echoing across the field. The two men stood in silence, the ordinary day unraveling around them. A sharp metallic creak came from inside the shed, though the door never moved. But soon, small details refused to stay hidden. When morning broke, the field was covered in pale frost. Daniel rubbed his hands together as they stepped out of the farmhouse, the crunch of grass under their boots, sharp in the cold air. The sky was streaked pink and gray, breath visible in front of them. For a September morning, it felt colder than it should have. Luke was the first to notice it. "Look," he muttered, pointing. The frost covered everything except the roof of the shed. The crooked boards glistened wet, as though the ice had melted only there, long before the sun had risen. A strip of moisture slid down the side, darker than the rest of the wood. Daniel frowned. Could just be heat escaping, probably holes in the roof. But even as he said it, the words lacked conviction. He had seen old sheds before. Holes in the roof let in rain, maybe animals. But they didn't melt frost in one single patch. They walked closer. The air seemed different here, stiller. Like the wind refused to cross this part of the field. The boards of the shed leaned crookedly, nails sticking out like jagged teeth. Luke ran a hand over the door frame, his fingers tracing the uneven surface, until they paused at the hinges. He crouched low, squinting. "Dan, look at this." The welds, they weren't old and rusted like the rest of the shed. They were fresh, clean. Small ridges of shiny metal sealed the hinges, as though someone had recently worked a torch against them. The door wasn't just locked, it had been sealed shut. Daniel knelt beside him, his brow furrowed. He touched the edge with the tip of his glove. The seam was smooth, no flaking rust, no sign of age. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. His voice dropped. "That's not farm work." Luke tilted his head, smirking despite the unease in his eyes. "Maybe old man Weller got tired of kids messing around and locked it up for good." Daniel shook his head. Weller had sold this land years ago. No one claimed it now. He stepped back, staring at the shed from a wider angle. From above, the frost still clung to the grass, sparkling white. But here, right around the shed, the soil looked damp, almost as if the ground itself had sweated. Daniel tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow. Probably nothing. Some chemical leak or something. Luke raised an eyebrow. "Since when do chemicals weld doors shut?" Daniel had no answer. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, as though the gesture alone could keep unease at bay. For a while they said nothing. The silence between them pressed as heavy as the cold air. A crow flapped overhead, its caw startlingly loud, then vanished toward the woods. Luke kicked at the base of the shed, the thud ringing through the boards. At first it was just the dull sound of wood against boot. But then a hollow metallic echo followed. It wasn't the sound of an empty shed. It was deeper, heavier, as though something solid and unnatural lay inside. The sound seemed to travel down into the ground, reverberating beneath their feet. Luke froze, his boot still pressed against the wood. His grin faltered. "You heard that, right?" Daniel swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. "Yeah." The echo faded, but its weight lingered. Both brothers stood still, staring at the sealed door, each silently measuring the same question. What in the world was inside? Daniel's thoughts flickered briefly to their father's barn years ago, when he and Luke had discovered an old tractor hidden under a tarp. For a moment, the memory almost gave comfort until he remembered the sound. Their father's tractor had never echoed like that. Daniel broke the silence, his voice strained. "It's nothing, just air trapped in there." But his own words betrayed him. His tone shook, betraying fear he didn't want Luke to see. Luke looked at him, smirk trying to return but failing. "Sure, Dan. Air that sounds like steel." The shed loomed before them, its welded seams glinting faintly in the morning light. Neither brother stepped closer. The ground under their boots felt too hollow, the silence around them too heavy. They turned away, heading back toward the farmhouse, but both walked slower now, shoulders tense, as if expecting the echo to follow. Daniel's hands were fists in his pockets. Luke kept glancing over his shoulder. Behind them, the shed remained crooked and silent, but the metallic echo seemed to hang in the air, a sound they couldn't shake. And then, just as the farmhouse came into view, there was another sound, a faint, irregular creak, long and slow, like a hinge straining under weight. The brothers spun, eyes locking on the shed in the distance. The door hadn't moved, the lock still gleamed, unbroken, yet the sound had been real, carrying across the frost. The hair on Daniel's neck bristled. He felt the instinct to run, to get away, though his boots were rooted in the soil. Luke whispered, "It's not empty." A low metallic echo sounded when Luke kicked the shed, reverberating deep into the ground, as if the earth itself was hiding something. By now, denial was no longer enough. The next morning, Daniel tried to throw himself into routine. He spent the early hours bent over a pickup truck engine in his garage, tools clinking, the smell of oil steady and grounding. But his focus wavered. Each metallic clang seemed to echo with the same hollow sound he'd heard at the shed. When Luke showed up at the garage door, leaning with arms crossed and a half grin, Daniel knew he hadn't been the only one haunted. "Still thinking about it?" Luke asked. Daniel tightened a bolt too hard, the wrench slipping. "Number, it's just a shed." Luke raised an eyebrow. "A shed with welded hinges that sings back when you kick it?" Daniel's silence was answer enough. By late afternoon, they found themselves walking back across the field. Neither spoke much. The wind carried only the steady rustle of tall grass and the distant barking of a dog. The shed waited where they'd left it, tilted and crooked, yet strangely stubborn in its stance. Up close, the unease sharpened. Scratches marred the wood near the doorframe. Not natural splits from rot, but deep gouges, like something had clawed or pried at it. Daniel crouched, running a calloused finger across one. The edges were rough, fresh enough to splinter against his skin. "Someone tried to break in," he muttered. Luke's eyes flicked to the sealed hinges. "Or out." The words hung heavy in the cool air. Daniel straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. He scanned the ground, expecting the usual signs of age, crumbling soil, weeds creeping. Instead, the earth was packed down, unnaturally hard. He stomped his boot, expecting a muffled thud. Instead, the sound was flat, almost muted, like something dense lay just beneath the surface. His chest tightened. The ground didn't feel like ground. A wide shot from above would have shown it clearly. Thin cracks spidered away from the shed, stretching like veins into the field. Some were so narrow they barely showed, others wide enough to trap fallen leaves. Luke bent to peer at one, dropping a pebble inside. They listened as it clicked faintly against something below, then vanished into silence. Luke whistled low. "That's not right." Daniel clenched his jaw. Could be just settling earth. Since when does earth settle in straight lines? He had no reply. The brothers circled the shed. On the far side, the soil was darker, damp, almost as if water had leaked from somewhere underneath. Yet no puddles formed. The ground drank it all, greedily, leaving only dark stains. The air thickened with tension. Even the wind seemed to avoid this patch of land. As they stood there, a voice startled them. "Afternoon, boys." They spun to see a neighbor trudging along the property line, a wiry man named Harris, cap pulled low, his dog tugging at the leash. He paused, squinting at the shed, then at them. "You two poking around that old thing?" Luke shrugged casually, though his shoulders were tense. "Just curious." Harris spit into the grass. "Best leave it. Been here longer than I've lived around. Folks said it was useless back when I moved in. And I've been here 30 years. Daniel asked, "Who built it?" Harris shook his head. "Nobody remembers. Farmers came and went, but that thing stayed. Weathered storms that should have knocked it flat. Always thought it was strange." His gaze lingered a moment longer, then he tugged the leash. "Best not touch it. Things like that are better left alone." His dog whined, tail tucked low, pulling against the leash as though it wanted nothing to do with the shed. The neighbor moved on, leaving the brothers standing in silence again. Luke let out a shaky laugh. Comforting, isn't he? But Daniel's eyes stayed locked on the cracks spreading through the earth. He felt the weight of the shed pressing outward, as though it claimed the ground beneath their boots. Then came the strangest moment yet. A small puddle lay near one of the cracks, rainwater collected from earlier in the week. Daniel noticed the surface ripple, though the air was still. He frowned, crouching. Before he could speak, The water began to sink fast. It spiraled inward, pulled down into the crack like a drain had opened beneath it. Within seconds, the puddle was gone. Only damp soil remained, already drying in the cool air. Luke cursed under his breath. "Tell me you saw that." Daniel's mouth went dry. "Yeah, I saw it." The shed loomed above them, silent, as if waiting for their next move. The puddle vanished into the earth, sucked down through the cracks, as though the ground itself was feeding something beneath the shed. That morning, the ground itself seemed alive. The brothers stood before the shed, crowbars in hand, the weight of their decision pressing as heavy as the humid air. Neither wanted to admit how long they'd argued about it, Daniel warning they should leave it, Luke insisting they couldn't walk away now. In the end, curiosity won. Or maybe it was something deeper, something pulling them forward. Luke wedged his crowbar into the gap by the frame, teeth clenched. Metal screeched as he pried. The sound tore through the quiet field like nails on steel, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. Daniel braced himself, pressing against the opposite hinge. Together, they strained until the first seam cracked. Sparks of loose weld spat to the ground. The smell of scorched metal rose, sharp and bitter in their noses. Sweat trickled down Luke's forehead. His jaw tightened as he heaved, the crowbar biting deeper. Daniel's arms shook with the effort. The door resisted, as though something inside wanted it sealed. Finally, with a brutal metallic snap, the lock tore free. The door swung inward, screeching on its hinges, and dust burst from the darkness. The brothers staggered back, coughing, shielding their eyes from the cloud. Inside, a dim shaft of light spilled across the floorboards, revealing a sight neither expected. Military crates, stacked in crooked towers, their surfaces stenciled with faded letters and insignias. Some were dented, others rusted along the edges, but all bore the unmistakable marks of property once belonging to the U.S. Army. Luke's face went pale. "What the hell is this?" Daniel stepped forward cautiously, the old wood creaking beneath his boots. He wiped at one of the crates, brushing away grime. The letters became clearer. ORDNANC. His chest tightened. These weren't farming tools. These were munitions. Beside the crates, uniforms lay piled in a heap, dusty, moth-eaten, their patches almost worn away. A helmet sat on top, dented, the chin strap frayed. The sight was too specific, too deliberate. Daniel's hands trembled as he picked up a weathered envelope lying across a crate. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age. He pulled it open carefully. Inside were typed letters, faded but legible. Strange insignias appeared at the bottom, symbols neither man recognized. Luke's voice cracked. Why would something like this be out here? In a shed? Daniel didn't answer. His eyes darted around the cramped space. Every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary stash. Whoever put it here wanted it hidden and welded shut. Then Luke froze. His boot had knocked against something in the center of the shed. Not wood, not dirt, metal. They crouched together, brushing away dust. There it was, a heavy trapdoor, iron bolts, sealing it against the floorboards. The surface was scratched, gouged, as if it had been forced open once before or had resisted something trying to come up. Daniel's stomach twisted. The echo they'd heard, it hadn't been just the walls. It had come from below. Luke gripped the crowbar tighter, his voice low but urgent. "We need to see what's down there." Daniel shook his head, panic flaring. "We've already gone too far. This isn't ours to open." Luke shot him a sharp look. "And what? Leave it? Pretend we didn't see? You know we can't." Daniel's pulse hammered. He thought of their father, of the lessons drilled into them. Some things you fix, some things you leave alone. But his younger brother's eyes were locked on the trapdoor, restless, daring. The shed felt tighter, air pressed close around them. The crates loomed like silent guards. The uniforms seemed to watch from the shadows. Every creak of the floor felt alive. Daniel reached out with shaking hands, brushing the dust from the trapdoor's handle. The iron was icy cold, colder than it should have been in the warm morning air. He jerked his hand back, heart pounding. The silence broke with Luke's voice, steady but hoarse. "Whatever's down there, somebody didn't want us to find it." Daniel's breath caught. He couldn't argue. The shed seemed to shudder, as though the ground itself acknowledged the truth. Beneath the crates and dust, the heavy trapdoor waited, its scratched surface whispering of secrets buried deeper than the shed. Would you call for help if you saw the ground breathing? But the discovery refused to stay buried. That evening, the shed lingered in both men's minds like a splinter beneath the skin. They had left it behind, door still hanging open, dust clouds settling back over the crates and uniforms. Yet walking away hadn't freed them. If anything, it had made things worse. The farmhouse felt colder than usual. The floorboards creaked more sharply beneath their boots, and every shadow stretched too long across the walls. Daniel dropped heavily into the old armchair in the front room, his shoulders stiff, eyes unfocused. Luke paced by the window, pulling the curtain back every few minutes to glance out across the dark field. Neither spoke at first. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint rattle of loose siding against the house. Finally, Daniel muttered, "We shouldn't have opened it." Luke shot him a look. "And just leave it locked up? Pretend we never saw those crates?" "Yes." Daniel's voice was flat, heavy with finality. "Some things aren't meant to be touched." Luke scoffed, but his pacing didn't stop. His energy was wound too tight, nerves fraying. He kept running his hands through his hair, pausing at the window, listening to sounds outside that Daniel couldn't hear. As night deepened, the tension only grew. Daniel tried to distract himself with the television, but the flickering screen cast the room in pale, uneven light that made every corner seem alive. Luke drifted into the kitchen, then back again, unable to sit still. When they finally climbed upstairs, neither truly expected to sleep. Daniel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the old plaster cracks shifting in the moonlight. His body was tired, but his mind refused to slow. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the trapdoor scratched, bolted, waiting. He thought of the echo when Luke kicked the wall. He thought of the puddle sinking into the cracks. He thought of the uniforms watching from the shadows. At some point, his body slipped into the edge of sleep. That's when the dream came. He was back in the field, fog curling low around his boots. The shed stood straight this time, no longer crooked, its wood dark and new, hinges gleaming. The door opened smoothly, silently. Inside, no crates, only rows of boots, polished and lined in perfect formation. They weren't empty. Legs extended from them, torsos, faces hidden in shadows. He could hear them breathing, dozens of breaths in unison. Then boots stomped, a synchronized step shaking the ground. Daniel jerked awake, chest heaving, heart pounding against his ribs. The room was dark, silent. Only the faint outline of furniture greeted him, but his ears rang with the echo of those phantom boots. Down the hall, a floorboard creaked. "Luke?" Daniel whispered. No answer. He swung his legs off the bed, the wood cold beneath his feet. Every instinct told him to stay still, yet he found himself moving toward the window. The field stretched pale under moonlight, the shed a dark silhouette in the distance. He could swear the air above it shimmered, faint and wavering, as though heat rose from the ground despite the night chill. Then a sound, a hollow groan, low and guttural, rising from beneath the earth. It vibrated through the floor, rattling his window pane. Daniel staggered back, heart hammering. At that exact moment, Luke burst into his room, wide-eyed, hair disheveled. "You heard it too," he said, his voice more statement than question. Daniel nodded, throat too dry to answer. The farmhouse seemed to settle again, quiet returning. But it was a false quiet. They both knew it. The sound hadn't been in their heads. It had come from beneath the shed. Neither brother slept for the rest of the night. In the dead silence after midnight, a hollow groan rose from beneath the shed, rattling the brothers awake. It was no longer just in their imagination. By morning, he was no longer the only one who noticed. Daniel barely touched his coffee, staring at the mug as steam curled upward and vanished. His hands trembled each time he lifted it. Across the table, Luke was restless, tapping his fingers against the wood, eyes darting to the window every other second. Both men looked exhausted, the hollow grooves under their eyes proof that the shed hadn't let them rest. "Can't sit here all day," Luke finally muttered. "We need to go back." Daniel didn't answer. He knew Luke would drag him there whether he wanted to or not. By mid-morning, they found themselves trudging across the field again. The air was heavy, damp from overnight fog, and the grass clung wet against their boots. Ahead, the shed leaned in its same crooked stance, but something about it felt changed. The way it caught the light, the way the ground around it seemed darker than the rest, it drew the eye like a wound in the land. And this time, they weren't alone. At the fence line, a cluster of kids had gathered, middle school age, daring each other to get closer, their voices carried in the still air. "Bet you won't touch the door," one boy taunted. "You do it first," another shot back. A smaller girl with pigtails shook her head fiercely. My brother says people disappear in there. The brothers exchanged tense glances. Daniel's stomach sank. It wasn't supposed to spread this fast. Go home, Daniel called, his voice sharp. The kids froze, eyes wide, before scattering like startled birds, sprinting down the lane. Their laughter and shouts faded, but the unease lingered. Luke muttered, Told you. Folks are talking. Daniel wiped his palms against his jeans. Then we need to shut this down before it gets worse. But shutting it down wasn't so simple. As they approached the shed, another figure appeared at the property's edge, Mrs. Carver, their elderly neighbor, wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the day. She leaned against her cane, eyes narrowed toward the shed. I saw the light last night, she said, voice thin but steady, coming from under it, like the ground itself was glowing. Daniel felt his skin crawl. You must have imagined it. She shook her head slowly, her face creased with certainty. I know what I saw. The air seemed to tighten. Luke kicked at the dirt, his energy bristling, unable to stand still. Daniel's gaze locked on the shed again, uneasy, defensive. Already, rumors were rooting themselves. They stepped closer to the structure, circling it the way they had before. The cracks in the ground looked wider today, thin slivers stretching farther outward, like veins branching into the soil. Daniel crouched beside one, sliding a finger across the edge. The dirt was damp again, though it hadn't rained. Luke pressed his hand against the wall. The wood was cold, colder than the morning air. And then he felt it a faint vibration, pulsing beneath his palm. He jerked back, his breath catching. Dan, he whispered, his voice sharp. It's moving. Daniel pressed his own hand against the wall. At first, nothing. Then, just faintly, the same subtle tremor, like the wood was alive with some slow heartbeat. He pulled back, face pale. Before either man could speak, a new voice came from behind them. This ain't natural. An older man stood at the fence line, cap pulled low, cigarette dangling from his lips. He was one of the long-timers, a man who rarely spoke unless spoken to. Yet his tone carried a finality that made the brothers' blood run cold. Someone put it here, he added. The silence that followed was heavier than the fog itself. Luke swallowed hard, trying to mask his fear with bravado. If someone put it here, we'll find out who. Daniel shook his head slowly. His instincts screamed the opposite, that some doors were meant to stay shut, some secrets not dragged into the light. From above, the scene looked cinematic. Neighbors watching from the edges, two brothers pressed close to the crooked shed, its cracked earth spreading wider like a scar through the field. The whole town was beginning to lean closer, drawn to something they didn't yet understand. And then, a thunderous thud from inside the shed. The sound rattled the wood, made the walls tremble as dust cascaded from the roof. Birds lifted in a dark cloud from the trees. The neighbors gasped, some backing away, others clutching at fences. Luke instinctively stepped forward, fists clenched. Daniel grabbed his arm, holding him back, eyes locked on the trembling door. Whatever lay inside, it was no longer quiet. A deafening thud shook the shed walls, sending dust spilling from its roof, the first violent answer to their questions. The secret was no longer his alone. By the next day, word of the shed had spread farther than the fence line. What began as whispers among children and cautious mutters from neighbors turned into something bigger, louder. The town itself seemed to buzz with it. At the grocery store checkout, Daniel caught two women lowering their voices when he walked past. At the gas station, Luke overheard a group of teenagers daring each other to sneak out at night. Even at church on Sunday, the sermon's words barely carried because everyone's ears were tilted toward the murmurs spreading along the pews. I heard soldiers are buried under it. No, it's some kind of lab, government experiment. It's cursed. My grandfather always said so. One boy's voice shook as he muttered in the pews. I heard it's a graveyard under there. The words carried farther than he meant, sharp enough to cut through the church air. Heads turned, eyes narrowing, some faces fearful, others skeptical. Each whisper carried a threat. Curiosity was turning into hysteria. For Daniel and Luke, the pressure mounted with every glance. They couldn't step into town without someone's eyes lingering on them, questions bubbling unspoken. It felt like carrying a burden on their backs, one neither had asked for. That evening, they found themselves back at the field. They didn't want to go, but the pull was relentless. The shed drew them like a magnet, demanding attention. The ground looked worse. The cracks had widened since yesterday, splitting the soil in jagged lines. Weeds around the base were shriveled, yellowed, as though leached of life. Even the air felt different here, heavier, muffled. Their boots sank slightly into damp patches as they circled the shed. Luke kicked a stone into one of the cracks. It bounced once, then vanished into the dark. No sound of it hitting bottom. Just silence. "Doesn't end," Luke whispered. Daniel stared, jaw tight. "Something's under there. Something big." A rustle caught their attention. 3 teenagers stood near the fence, watching, pretending they weren't. One of them, a boy in a football jacket, cupped his hands and shouted, "Bet you're too scared to open it again." His friends snickered, but the bravado was thin, their faces pale in the dimming light. Daniel's temper flared. "Go home!" His voice cracked across the field. The boys bolted, leaving only echoes of their laughter behind. Luke shook his head, lips pressed thin. This is getting out of hand. And it was. By dusk, more people had gathered, lingering at the fence line. Not many, but enough to make the brothers' skin prickle. Flashlights cut through the fog, beams sweeping across the crooked silhouette of the shed. Murmurs carried in the air. Some swore they'd seen light beneath the cracks. Others claimed they heard whispers, not thuds, echoing from the ground. Daniel stood stiffly, fists at his sides, staring at the crowd. "They're turning this place into a circus." Luke's reply was quieter, edged with unease. "Maybe it already is one." From above, the scene looked almost surreal. The shed at the center, its ground scarred and cracked, brothers circling like reluctant guards, and a swelling crowd pressing closer, hungry for answers. The old silence of the farm had been replaced by restless tension. And then came the first real intrusion. Headlights cut across the field. A sheriff's truck rolled to a stop, tires crunching over gravel. Sheriff Briggs climbed out, broad-shouldered, jaw set hard beneath the brim of his hat. He surveyed the scene, neighbors clutching flashlights, kids peering wide-eyed, the Carter brothers standing tense in the field. "What's this I hear about trouble?" His voice carried, low and steady, the kind meant to settle crowds. No one answered at first. A woman finally spoke up. "That shed. Something's wrong with it." Briggs frowned, glancing toward the crooked structure. His eyes narrowed at the welded seams, the cracks in the earth. He said nothing for a long moment, just stared. Luke spoke before Daniel could stop him. "We opened it. There's crates inside, military stuff, and a trapdoor." The sheriff's expression flickered quick, subtle, but enough for Daniel to notice. He turned back to the crowd, forcing calm into his tone. "Everybody go on home. Nothing to see here. Just an old shed." But nobody moved. The tension clung thick as the fog rolling low across the field. Daniel's stomach knotted. He'd seen that look in the sheriff's eyes. Briggs knew something, or at least suspected it. Luke stepped closer, voice low. He's not going to leave it alone. And Daniel knew he was right. Sheriff Briggs lingered at the shed's door, fingers brushing the welded seam, his frown deepening before he turned back and quietly said, "I'll be back." Now the law stood at his fence line. The morning after Sheriff Briggs's visit, the Carter brothers found the field far from quiet. 2 patrol cars idled by the dirt road, lights off but presence unmistakable. Deputies leaned against their hoods, sipping coffee, eyes fixed on the shed like hunters waiting for prey to stir. Daniel cursed under his breath. He hadn't wanted this. Luke, though, looked almost vindicated. "Told you it wouldn't end with us," he muttered. Briggs arrived not long after, stepping out of his truck with slow authority. His boots crunched the gravel as he crossed the field, hat tilted low against the Sunday. He didn't look at the growing crowd of neighbors. He didn't look at Daniel or Luke either. His gaze went straight to the shed. From up close, the crooked structure looked even stranger. The welded seams gleamed under daylight, fresh and deliberate against the weathered wood. Cracks split wider across the ground, forming jagged patterns that seemed unnatural, too precise. Briggs ran a hand across his jaw, then finally addressed the brothers. "You said crates?" Daniel's throat felt dry. "Yes, military. Old, but not broken down. And a trapdoor under them." Briggs's expression didn't change, though his jaw tightened slightly. "Show me." Daniel hesitated. Every instinct screamed that letting this man in would make it permanent, no turning back. But Luke was already walking toward the shed. Daniel followed, shoulders stiff. Inside, dust hung in the air. The morning light cut through the broken roof, slanting across stacked crates and faded uniforms. Briggs stepped slowly, his boots heavy on the warped floorboards. He crouched near one crate, brushing his hand over the faded stencil. His eyes lingered, unreadable. He tapped the lid, Don't open it. Luke frowned. Why not? Don't you need to see what's inside? Briggs shot him a sharp look. I said don't. The sheriff circled the space, his gaze finally settling on the trapdoor. He squatted, tracing the deep scratches gouged into the iron, his lips pressed thin. He stayed there longer than he should have, fingertips hovering just above the surface as though he could feel something radiating from below. Finally, he stood. Seal this back up. Daniel blinked. Seal it? You heard me. And the sheriff turned toward the doorway, but his deputy interrupted, pointing at the cracked soil outside. Sheriff Ground's wrong here. Feels hollow. He stomped his boot, the muted sound confirming it. Like something's underneath. Briggs's eyes flickered, irritation breaking through his calm. I said leave it. But the crowd outside had grown. More neighbors, more flashlights, more whispers. People pressed against the fence, peering in. They hadn't heard his command, but they'd seen his hesitation. Curiosity fed itself like wildfire. A man's voice carried from the crowd. What's in there? Another, why's the sheriff looking so nervous? The murmurs swelled. Daniel's chest tightened. The field didn't feel like his anymore. His family's land had turned into a stage, and everyone wanted a front row seat. Briggs stepped out, jaw set. Back away. This is county property now. The words cut deep. Daniel's fists clenched. That's my land. Briggs didn't look at him. Not anymore. The deputies moved forward, unrolling caution tape, staking it into the ground. Yellow strips flapped in the breeze, slicing the field into forbidden zones. The crowd pressed closer, whispering, snapping photos on old phones. Their excitement mingled with fear. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet, not literally, but in the way a man knows when control has slipped. He wanted to shout, to drive them all away, but his throat closed around the words. Luke stood beside him, jaw set, knuckles white. By mid-afternoon, another truck arrived. This time it wasn't a patrol car. It was a county vehicle loaded with equipment ground-penetrating scanners, cases of tools. Men climbed out, not in uniforms but in plain coveralls, moving with practiced efficiency. They didn't speak much, didn't look at the crowd. Their eyes stayed locked on the shed. Briggs oversaw silently, arms crossed. The scanners hummed to life, low vibrations pulsing through the soil. A screen flickered, displaying ghostly images beneath the ground. Daniel caught a glimpse, dark voids, rigid shapes where earth should have been solid. One of the men leaned closer, whispering something to Briggs. The sheriff's jaw clenched tighter. He nodded once. Daniel stepped forward. What is it? What do you see? Briggs blocked his view, voice low and clipped. Step back. Daniel's anger flared. That's my land. You don't... Step back. The command cracked like a gunshot. The deputies moved in, steering both brothers away. The crowd murmured louder, questions flying, tension thick as storm clouds. Daniel's chest heaved with frustration, helplessness boiling inside. He glanced at Luke, who looked more restless than afraid, his eyes locked on the shed as if he could burn through the wood and see what lay below. From the shed, the faint vibration returned. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. The scanner operator froze, tapping the screen. The lines blurred, distorted, as though something below had interfered. The sheriff's face paled. He whispered to his deputy, too low for anyone else to hear. But Daniel saw his lips move. This was never supposed to be found. Sheriff Briggs's face turned pale as he whispered to his deputy. This was never supposed to be found. Do you think this is natural or something far darker? What the experts saw made their faces turn pale. The field, once just a quiet stretch of farmland, now swarmed with activity. Trucks rolled in, unloading heavy cases. Men in coveralls set up floodlights that cut harsh beams through the early evening fog. The yellow caution tape sagged under the press of curious neighbors, their flashlights dotting the fence line like fireflies. Daniel stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight, the farmhouse looming dimly behind him. His land no longer felt like his. Deputies kept him back, refusing to let him step closer. Luke bristled at his side, pacing like a caged dog. Inside the shed, the scanners had already told their story. Hollow spaces, large and structured, ran beneath the floor. Now the crew prepared to see it for themselves. The trapdoor's bolts groaned as tools bit into them. Sparks flared in the gloom, showering the floorboards. The smell of heated metal and burning dust filled the air. Daniel felt it in his bones, the way a man feels lightning before a storm breaks. Finally, the last bolt clattered loose. The iron slab shifted, then lifted. A cold draft poured upward. It smelled not of soil or rot, but of something chemical, bitter and metallic. The crowd at the fence leaned forward as one, holding their breath. A deputy aimed his flashlight into the hole. The beam vanished into the dark, swallowed too quickly. He frowned, adjusting the angle, then stepped aside as one of the crew lowered a portable floodlight down on a cable. The light swung, revealing a staircase concrete, descending at a sharp angle, edges damp and crumbling. Rust streaked the walls. Luke muttered, barely audible, "It's a bunker." Briggs's face was tight, unreadable. "Stay here," he ordered, motioning to his deputies. Two men clipped flashlights to their vests and descended the stairs, boots echoing on the hollow concrete. The crowd shifted uneasily, murmurs rising. Floodlights outside buzzed, moths fluttering against the harsh glow. Daniel's chest constricted with every second that passed. He wanted to go down there himself. But the deputy's wall of bodies kept him frozen at the surface. Minutes dragged. Then one deputy's voice crackled through the radio, strained, too high. "You need to see this." The crew lowered another light into the bunker. Its glow spread across the cavernous space below, illuminating rows of barrels stacked against the walls. Their metal skins were corroded, paint peeling, but the hazard symbols stenciled on their sides were still visible. Faded yellow triangles, black radiation icons. Gas masks lay scattered across the floor, rubber cracked, lenses clouded. Maps were pinned to a wall, corners curling, their markings unfamiliar lines and circles drawn in red, notes scribbled in military code. The crowd gasped. A murmur rippled outward like a wave. Luke grabbed Daniel's arm, voice tight. "This isn't just storage. This was built for something." Daniel's stomach twisted. He remembered their father telling them, as children, about the Cold War, about drills in schools, about shelters stocked with supplies, just in case. He'd always thought it was history, something distant and over. But here it was, buried in their own backyard. More deputies descended, their beams slicing through the shadows. One knelt near a barrel, tapping it cautiously. "Still sealed," he said, but his voice shook. Another pointed at the wall. "Sheriff over here." Briggs moved closer, peering down from the trapdoor. The deputy's flashlight illuminated a rusted metal sign bolted into the concrete. "Property of us defense authorized personnel only." The sheriff's lips thinned. "Pull them out," he ordered. The men hesitated. "Sir, if these leak—" I said, "Pull them out." Slowly, carefully, the crew began lifting barrels, crates, and files up through the trapdoor. Each item that surfaced sent a ripple of gasps through the crowd. A child cried out, pulled back by a nervous parent. Reporters had arrived now, cameras flashing, microphones shoved over shoulders. The brothers stood frozen. The world had shifted in front of their eyes. Their private land had become a stage, their secret discovery a public spectacle. Daniel's heart hammered. He wanted to demand answers, to shout over the noise, but Briggs's expression stopped him cold. The sheriff leaned close to his deputy, his voice low but caught by Daniel's ears. "This was never supposed to be found." The words landed heavier than the crates themselves. Daniel exchanged a look with Luke. His brother's eyes burned, alive with both fear and restless hunger. Neither of them spoke, but the silence said everything. They had stumbled into something far bigger than they could ever control. From above, the field looked transformed, floodlights blazing, crowd pressing, men in coveralls swarming over relics of a hidden war. And beneath it all, the bunker still yawned open, its dark corners unexplored, secrets still buried in shadow. Beneath their land lay a hidden Cold War bunker barrels, gas masks, maps, and files pulled into the light, while officials muttered, "This was never supposed to be found." By nightfall, the whole town was talking. The Carter farmhouse, once a lonely silhouette on the edge of quiet fields, now glowed under the glare of headlights and news vans. Satellite dishes sprouted along the road like weeds, their blinking red lights casting eerie dots across the darkness. Reporters shouted questions into cameras, their voices tumbling into the night air. Neighbors who had once waved politely from porches now pressed against the fence line, holding cell phones aloft, recording every angle. Children leaned on their parents' shoulders, pointing wide-eyed at the floodlit shed. The hum of generators filled the night, powering cameras, lights, and microphones that seemed to multiply with every passing hour. Daniel stood on his porch, fists tight against the railing. He wanted to scream at them to leave, to shove every last van off his land. But the caution tape that sliced across the field made it clear this wasn't his anymore. Beside him, Luke leaned forward, eyes fixed on the crowd. Where Daniel saw intrusion, Luke saw opportunity or maybe destiny. His expression burned with restless energy, jaw set, as though this chaos had been waiting for him all along. Down by the shed, workers in coveralls continued their excavation. Barrel after barrel rose from the trapdoor, their corroded shells reflecting harsh white light. Each time one surfaced, gasps rippled through the crowd. A reporter's voice carried. Uncovered Cold War stockpile danger to residents, or hidden treasure. Another countered. Local brothers at the center of secret military scandal. Daniel's stomach twisted. His name was already in their mouths, his family's land already reduced to headlines. By midnight, the chaos had grown stranger. A small group of townspeople gathered with candles, kneeling in the grass, murmuring prayers. Others shouted at deputies, demanding answers, their anger sharp against the hum of machinery. Some swore the barrels contained chemical weapons. Others whispered about bodies sealed inside. From above, the scene looked like a carnival of fear candles flickering, flashbulbs bursting, deputies struggling to hold a line against both protesters and gawkers. Daniel turned to Luke, voice raw. This is out of control. Luke didn't look away from the shed. Maybe it's supposed to be. Daniel clenched his jaw. This is our home, Luke, not theirs. Not theirs to gawk at, to tear apart. But Luke shook his head slowly, eyes reflecting the floodlights. It hasn't been hours since we opened that door. The words landed like a stone in Daniel's chest. He looked at his brother, then at the chaos unfolding below. The land felt stolen not just by officials but by the weight of history itself. Down near the shed, tension broke. A protester shoved against the deputy's line, shouting, "You're hiding something from us." More voices joined in, anger swelling. One woman cried out, "My children live here, what's in those barrels?" Briggs appeared, stepping into the glow of the floodlights. His voice cut through the crowd. "Go home. This is restricted property now. You have no business here." But the words only fanned the fire. Cameras swung to capture every face, every shout. Microphones shoved closer. The air swelled with noise questions, accusations, demands. Daniel could feel it from the porch, the field itself shaking under the weight of so many restless voices. Then came the sound, low, guttural, from beneath the earth. A groan that carried through the soil, rattling the barrels stacked outside, shivering the floorboards of the shed. For one frozen moment, everyone fell silent. Even the reporters lowered their microphones, eyes wide. The earth stilled again, quiet returning like a held breath. But it was too late. The silence only deepened the panic. Cries erupted. Protesters screamed for answers. Some fled toward the road, others pushed harder against the tape. Deputies barked orders, hands on weapons. On the porch, Daniel gripped the railing, knuckles white. "It's going to tear this town apart," Luke whispered, almost reverently. "No, Dan. It's already done that." From above, the once quiet farm was no longer recognizable. Floodlights, crowds, flashing cameras, armed deputies, and in the center of it all, the crooked shed and its yawning trapdoor. The Carter brothers' lives had become a spectacle, their home a symbol of something far darker. As the last padlock snapped over the shed's door, sealing it once more, the ground itself seemed to groan in protest louder this time, as though whatever lay below resented being buried again. Then came the men who spoke in whispers. By the following afternoon, the sheriff and his deputies were no longer in charge. Black SUVs rolled up the gravel lane in a column, their tinted windows reflecting only sky. The vehicles parked in perfect formation, engines cutting off in unison. Doors opened, and men in dark suits stepped out, no badges shown, no names offered. They moved with precision, boots crunching against gravel, briefcases swinging at their sides. Their eyes scanned everything, the farmhouse, the shed, the brothers, even the crowd at the fence line. And without a word, the deputies stepped back. Sheriff Briggs didn't protest. He didn't even look at Daniel or Luke. His shoulders sagged as though he had known this moment was coming. One man approached the brothers directly. He was tall, lean, his hair neat, his tie knotted too tight. He carried no folder, no papers, just a voice that cut like steel. "You are advised not to speak further of what you've seen. For your safety." Daniel blinked. "For our safety?" The man's eyes didn't flicker. "For everyone's." Luke's temper snapped. This is our land. You can't just. The man stepped closer, his voice dropping low enough for only them to hear. If you think this land is still yours, you're mistaken. Forget what you found, forget what you heard. That is the only way you walk away from this. The words landed like a verdict. Behind them, workers in coveralls replaced deputies, resealing the shed with new locks, welding seams shut with sparks that hissed in the dim light. The sound of the torch hissed through the air, sharp and final, like the burial of truth. The crowd at the fence grew restless. People shouted questions at the suited men, but none were answered. Cameras flashed until a firm hand shoved them back. Yellow tape doubled, thicker now, backed by the black wall of SUVs. From above, the field looked carved in two. Townsfolk on one side, restless and demanding, and silent officials on the other, burying the shed under layers of steel and silence. Daniel and Luke were pulled aside, not by force, but by presence alone. The tall man leaned close once more. You saw nothing. Say nothing. Your lives will go on, if you let them. Daniel's voice cracked. And if we don't? The man's eyes were cold, unblinking. Then your lives won't go on at all. The threat wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. That night, the farmhouse no longer felt like home. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, the bulb above flickering faintly. Luke paced again, energy buzzing, unable to sit still. But now there was something heavier in his steps, anger burning under his skin. They can't bury it, Luke muttered. They can't. People saw it. Cameras caught it. It's too late to shut everyone up. Daniel looked up, his face drawn. You don't understand. They don't need everyone silent. Just us. We're the ones who opened it. We're the ones they'll make an example of. The words hung between them like smoke. A noise outside snapped their heads around. The crunch of gravel, the creak of the porch step. Daniel grabbed a flashlight, heart hammering. He pushed the curtain aside just in time to see it. A figure standing at the fence, perfectly still, watching the farmhouse. The porch light flicked on automatically, spilling a pale cone into the yard. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It only tilted its head, slow and deliberate, as though studying them. Daniel's breath caught. Luke. But when they blinked, the figure was gone. The fence line stood empty, the field stretched silent. Luke's fists clenched at his sides. They're watching us now, every move. Daniel sank into the chair again, his stomach twisting. The shed wasn't just a wound in the land anymore. It was a wound in their lives. The figure didn't move when the porch light snapped on it, only tilted its head, watching before vanishing into the dark, leaving the brothers certain they were no longer free. Every shadow now felt like a watcher. For days, Daniel barely left the farmhouse. He worked in silence at the garage, but his hands moved on autopilot, tightening bolts that didn't need tightening, wiping clean tools that weren't dirty. His customers noticed the hollowness in his eyes but said nothing. At night, he sat at the kitchen table with the lock from the shed turning slowly in his palm. Luke, on the other hand, grew sharper, louder. He called old friends in town, tried to chase rumors, muttered constantly about documents, photographs, anything that could prove what they had seen. He spent hours glued to the window, watching black SUVs cruise past the road at strange hours, headlights never dimming. The brothers argued more now than they ever had. Let it go, Daniel begged one night, voice low and broken. They're watching. They warned us. Luke slammed his fist against the counter. That's exactly why we can't. Don't you get it? If we stay quiet, they win. They bury it. And they bury us with it. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Outside, the world shifted. The shed itself had been sealed tighter than before. Double locks welded across its seams. Fresh concrete poured at its base. But the land still groaned. Cracks continued to widen, crawling outward like spreading veins. Weeds withered around it. Even birds no longer landed on the fence posts near the field. Neighbors whispered that the Carters were cursed. Some crossed the street when passing them in town. Others lingered too long, their eyes searching as if the brothers carried answers in their very skin. One evening, Daniel was driving home when headlights filled his rearview mirror. The car behind stayed close, too close, matching every turn. He pulled onto a side road, so did they. His heart pounded, palms slick on the wheel. Finally, when he pulled into the farmhouse drive, the car idled at the end of the lane for a long moment before easing away, taillights vanishing into the dark. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboard felt like a footstep. Every rustle of leaves outside felt like a man's breath against the glass. Then came the shed. Near midnight, Daniel sat awake at his window, staring across the field. Fog drifted low, silvered by the moon. At first, the shed was still. Then, faintly, its door rattled. Once, twice. A violent shudder that made the padlocks clink against the hinges. The air was dead calm. No wind moved the grass. Yet the door rattled again, harder this time, as if something pressed from within. Daniel's throat tightened. He almost called for Luke, but stopped. His brother had already been pushed too far by obsession. What good would it do to fuel him further? But he wasn't the only one who saw. From the far fence line, headlights flicked on. The beam of a vehicle cut through the fog, holding steady on the shed. Daniel's stomach turned cold. Someone else was watching, and they weren't hiding it anymore. The next morning, Luke stormed into the kitchen, his eyes bloodshot. "They're tailing me now, too. Someone followed me from the docks. Just sat there, staring, until I drove off." Daniel rubbed his face, exhaustion carved into his features. "Luke, listen to me. We have to stop. We have to keep our heads down, do nothing, say nothing. Number." Luke slammed both hands onto the table. "You want to live in fear. Fine. But I won't. I'd rather go down fighting than rot in silence." Daniel looked at him, heart aching. His brother's eyes burned, but behind the fire was desperation. He wasn't just angry. He was scared. Too scared to admit it out loud. The farmhouse felt smaller than ever. Walls closing in, silence pressing against them until even their breathing sounded too loud. From above, the scene was stark. The shed trembling in its cage of locks, the cracks bleeding outward across the soil, black SUVs patrolling the edges like wolves. And in the center, two brothers trapped between truth and survival. Daniel and Luke sat in silence, both knowing the truth they could no longer escape. They had to choose, bury the secret forever, or risk everything to drag it into the light. If this happened to you, what would you do? And then the last secret broke free. For days, the shed stayed sealed, its locks gleaming fresh, its cracks widening under the soil like veins of infection. Black SUVs came and went at odd hours, their tires crunching over gravel, their headlights sweeping the farmhouse windows. The brothers barely spoke. Their silence was broken only by the groans of the earth and the occasional rattle of the shed door in the dead calm of night. But silence never lasts in a town built on gossip. That week, a neighbor named Paul, one who had lived near the Carters his entire life, came to the farmhouse. He looked older than his years, his hands shaking as he gripped the brim of his hat. He wouldn't sit when Daniel offered a chair. He wouldn't look them in the eye. Finally, his words spilled out. "I saw it," he whispered. "Years ago. Trucks. Middle of the night. They came quiet. No lights. No markings. Backed right up to that shed." Daniel's chest tightened. "Why didn't you say anything?" Paul's voice cracked. "Because the sheriff was there." He waved them in. "He waved me off when I asked. Said if I valued my family, I'd forget what I saw. So I did." Luke's fists clenched, knuckles white. "You knew. All these years you knew." Paul's eyes glistened. "I thought it was done. I thought whatever they buried stayed buried until you two opened it again." His voice broke and he turned, stumbling out before either brother could stop him. The farmhouse was silent for a long time after he left. Daniel's thoughts churned like a storm. Luke finally spoke, his voice hoarse but sharp. "Briggs. It was Briggs all along." Daniel wanted to deny it, but the pieces fit. The sheriff's hesitation, his anger when the bunker was revealed, the way he'd tried to push everyone away. He hadn't been blindsided, he'd been complicit. By evening, the tension boiled over. Floodlights blazed once again over the field. Crews worked late, pulling more crates and barrels from the trapdoor. Reporters shouted questions. Deputies strained to hold back a restless crowd that pressed harder against the tape, their voices raw with demand. Daniel and Luke pushed to the front of the farmhouse porch, their eyes fixed on the sheriff. Briggs stood near the shed, arms crossed, expression stone. But when the crowd shouted his name, his jaw tightened. "Tell us what you knew, Sheriff." "You knew it was here." Briggs raised his hands, shouting over the noise. "That's enough. Everyone back." But the words didn't soothe this time. They stoked the fire. The Carters stepped down from the porch, walking into the chaos. Luke's voice ripped through the air, louder than the crowd. "He knew!" Every head turned. Floodlights caught his face, his features fierce, trembling with rage. "He was here when they brought it. He let them bury it. He let this rot under our ground for years." The crowd roared, Voices collided, questions twisted into accusations. Briggs's face paled under the lights, sweat glistening on his brow. He barked orders to his deputies, but they struggled to contain the growing frenzy. Daniel felt his knees weaken. He couldn't match Luke's fire. He couldn't even summon anger. Instead, betrayal hollowed him out, leaving only a sinking weight in his chest. His brother's roar filled the night, shaking the crates stacked in the floodlight's glare. Luke's roar shook the crates, but Daniel could only sink to his knees, hollow with betrayal. From above, the field looked fractured beyond repair. Officials swarming, neighbors screaming, reporters circling like vultures. And at the center, two brothers, torn between fury and despair, standing before a truth too heavy to bear. The earth itself seemed to shiver. The cracks near the shed widened, dirt falling into the void below. The trapdoor groaned, hinges straining against their new locks. And beneath it all, a deeper sound rose in echo, metallic and low, that rattled through the soil like a drumbeat from the past. The crowd froze, silenced by the sound. Even Briggs turned, his eyes wide for the first time. The shed trembled. The locks clinked. Dust sifted down from its crooked roof, and the ground gave one long, hollow groan, as though something beneath had finally stirred awake. The sheriff's betrayal ignited the crowd, but the earth itself roared louder. Something beneath the shed was breaking free. But some secrets never truly stay buried. In the weeks that followed, the Carter farmhouse no longer felt like a home but a scar on the land. The field remained sealed off. Black SUVs parked in rows like silent sentries. Federal crews worked quietly, pulling the last of the crates and barrels from beneath the shed. By the time they were finished, nothing remained but a concrete slab where the crooked structure had once stood. Yet the earth still looked wrong. Cracks laced the soil in jagged lines, spreading outward as if the ground itself refused to heal. Even birds avoided the place, their wings beating wide arcs to stay clear of it. For Daniel, life grew unbearably small. He went through the motions at the garage, fixing engines with hands that no longer trusted stability. Each night he sat at the kitchen table, the lock he had pried from the shed turning in his palm. Its weight was small, but its meaning crushed him. He turned the lock over in his palm each night, wondering if silence had cost him more than truth ever could. Luke, however, could not let go. His restlessness became obsession. He drove to libraries in neighboring towns, scoured old newspapers, and begged retired veterans for stories. Every lead deepened his conviction that what lay under their land was part of something far larger, something that stretched beyond their county, beyond their state. He muttered about secret tests, buried operations, betrayal by those sworn to protect. The brothers no longer argued, they simply drifted apart. Daniel sank into silence. Luke burned with restless fire. The secret had not only scarred their land, it had carved a canyon between them. The community, too, carried the wound. In town, whispers lingered in diners, barbershops, and church pews. Some swore the barrels were nuclear waste. Others believed it had been a hidden experiment gone wrong. Still others claimed soldiers had died beneath the shed and been left there to rot. Reporters wrote their stories, but none carried full answers. The officials who descended on the Carters' land had spoken little, and when they left, they took the truth with them. Sheriff Briggs resigned quietly, vanishing from office without explanation. Some said he'd been forced out, others that he'd been given a comfortable post elsewhere in exchange for silence. His house sat empty within weeks, blinds drawn, the mailbox overflowing with dust. The shed itself became legend. Children dared each other to sneak near the field, though the warnings posted on the fences promised fines and arrests. Locals told newcomers in hushed tones that's where the ground groaned like a living thing. Farmers refused to till land near it. At night, headlights slowed on the road, their drivers staring across the cracked soil before hurrying on. The Carters' lives had been devoured by a secret they hadn't asked to uncover. Daniel carried it like a stone in his chest, retreating further into silence. Luke carried it like fire, refusing to let it die, even if it burned him. But the land itself refused to let go. On certain nights, when fog lay thick over the fields, locals swore they still heard it, the faint metallic echo of hinges straining, rattling from beneath the slab where the shed had stood. Daniel heard it too, lying awake in his upstairs room. He never told Luke. He never told anyone. But each time the sound reached him through the night air, his hand tightened around the lock he kept by his bed. The secret had been sealed, but it had not been silenced. Even now, on windless nights, the faint metallic echo of hinges straining drifts across the field, like the shed remembers being forced open.